My name is Jake Anders. I'm 39 years old. Back in the fall of 2016, I took a week off from my job at a warehouse in Albany, New York. I'd been planning a quiet getaway deep in the Adirondacks. I didn't want company, didn't want to be around any bars, any people, or any phone signal. Just wanted the quiet, maybe a fire at night, some early morning hikes. Nothing fancy. I'd rented a cabin that was barely marked on any map, just a dot near a place called Hollow Road. Not even a road, really. It was a dirt path cutting through the woods, barely wide enough for my truck. The guy who owned the cabin, a retired forest ranger named Carl, had put it up on an old blog-style rental site. It wasn't part of Airbnb or anything polished. The listing looked old and untouched, but I emailed the guy and got a short reply with directions. No payment system, just cash on the table when I got there. I kind of liked that, made it feel off the grid. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest town, and that town didn't have much. A gas station, a bar with a pizza oven, and a sheriff's station that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 80s. That's where I first saw him, the cop. He was standing in front of the station as I passed through to stock up on supplies. Tall guy, shaved head, gray goatee, dark sunglasses even though it was overcast. His cruiser was parked right outside. It had mud all over the tires and even up the sides like it had just barreled through the woods. He watched me as I walked into the store across the street. Not casually either. I remember that. He didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared until I was out of his sight. Didn't think much of it at the time. Cops out there probably didn't get a lot of out-of-towners in October. Leaves were mostly fallen already. Weather was cold, and hunting season hadn't started yet. I figured he just clocked me as someone new. That's it. I bought canned food, water jugs, propane canisters, and a few bags of jerky. Paid in cash. Drove off without looking back. The road to the cabin got worse the deeper I went. Trees closed in tighter. I kept needing to slow down to avoid huge dips and roots breaking through the dirt. Finally, after crawling past a row of old stone fence posts, I saw the cabin up ahead. It was smaller than I thought, maybe 15 feet wide, with a metal roof and a crooked chimney. One window in the front, a solid-looking door, and a small overhang covering a woodpile. No lights. No sign of power cables either. That was fine by me. I parked next to a rusted-out shed that was half covered in moss. Inside the cabin, it smelled like wood and damp wool. There was a stove in the corner, a cot, a table, and a small bathroom with a dry toilet. Nothing fancy, just enough. I unloaded the supplies, stacked the firewood inside, set up my flashlight on a hook above the table, and cracked open a beer. It was quiet in a way you can't get anywhere near a town. No humming wires. No engines in the distance. Just wind through dry trees and the occasional sound of a branch snapping off under its own weight. I didn't see another person for the first 2 days. Hiked during the day, read at night. I found an old trail behind the cabin that led up to a ridge overlooking a dried-up riverbed. Every morning I'd make coffee on the little propane burner, eat a protein bar, and head out with my pack. The only odd thing I noticed early on was a set of deep tire tracks that cut through the trees about 100 yards from the cabin. Not fresh, but not old either. Like someone had been driving off-road out here not long before I showed up. I assumed they were Carl's. It wasn't until the third night that something started feeling wrong. I just turned in for the night. Fire was low. I was on the cot, under a thick wool blanket, listening to the wind scrape at the roof. Then I heard it. Car engine. Far off at first, then closer, then idling, maybe 50 yards away, behind the trees where the trail started. I sat up, killed the lantern, waited. The engine turned off. Silence again. I stepped outside, barefoot, just enough to scan the woods. I couldn't see anything. No lights. No movement. But I knew someone had parked out there. I stood for maybe 5 minutes watching. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved the table against it. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked out to where I thought the sound had come from, and I found it. A fresh set of tire marks, deep ones. Same kind of pattern as the old tracks I'd seen, narrow, aggressive treads. Off-road police tires. I recognized them. My brother was a mechanic. He used to rant about those kinds of builds for rural departments. And there was more. Next to the tracks were 2 boot prints. Big ones, deep heel marks. Whoever it was had gotten out, stood there for a while, then walked a few paces into the woods, then turned back. That day I stayed close to the cabin. Something about those prints unsettled me. I started to wonder if I was being watched. That night I built the fire bigger, closed the shutters, sat with a knife beside me on the cot. Nothing happened. No engine.
No sounds.
But around 2 a.m., I heard something bump the side of the shed. Just one thud, like someone had leaned or pressed on it. Then silence. The first light, I went out there and found it. A scratch, about shoulder height on the wood. Not from an animal. A deep, deliberate gouge. I traced it with my fingers. Still rough, still fresh. I decided to leave, packed everything, loaded the truck. But when I turned the key, nothing. Just a click. Battery was dead.
No lights.
Nothing. I popped the hood. Didn't see anything wrong, but I wasn't a mechanic. The battery cables looked like they'd been messed with. One of them was barely attached. Not loose from driving, loose like someone had unscrewed it, then placed it back just enough to look normal. I tightened it, tried again. This time the engine turned over once, then died. Second try, nothing. I stopped, stood up, listened. The forest was dead quiet. Not even birds. I decided I wasn't going to wait around anymore. I took my pack, stuffed it with water and food, and started hiking back toward the road. It was about 8 miles. I figured I could do it by sundown if I didn't stop. I made it 3 miles before I saw him. He was parked off the path. The same cop I'd seen at the sheriff's station. His cruiser was hidden behind some thick pine. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't stopped to take a drink of water. I froze behind a stump, crouched, barely breathing. He was sitting in the driver's seat, head tilted forward like he was asleep. But then I saw it, his eyes were open. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching. I backed away, slow, then turned and moved through the woods in the opposite direction. Not toward the cabin, toward the riverbed I'd found on one of my hikes. If I followed it downstream, I figured it would lead toward the main road eventually. Might take longer, but I didn't want to risk going back the way I came. It took the rest of the day, but I found the old railroad crossing that ran parallel to Route 19. I climbed up, followed the tracks for another hour, and reached the edge of town just after dark. I walked into the bar and asked to use the phone. Called a friend in Albany to come get me. Told the bartender I'd been camping and got lost. Didn't mention the cop. Didn't mention the cabin. Next day, we came back with a tow truck and picked up my vehicle. Battery had been pulled clean out. Just gone. Wires snipped. I never heard from Carl again. Never got a reply to the emails I sent. The cabin listing vanished a few weeks later. I checked every few months for a while. Nothing. About a year later, I was back in the area passing through. I stopped by that sheriff's station again. The cruiser was there. So was the cop. Same guy. Same stare. He watched me as I pumped gas across the street. Still wearing those dark sunglasses. Still standing like a statue. I looked up that department when I got home. Found a few news stories. The town had a history of missing hikers going back decades. Nothing recent. Nothing conclusive. But always the same area. Hollow Road. The woods north of it. I never reported what happened. I didn't see the point. That guy was the law out there. No one was going to touch him. He'd been doing it a long time, I'm sure of it, waiting for people to wander too far out, messing with their vehicles, tracking them through the woods. Some people he probably let go, some he didn't. I sold my camping gear the next month. Haven't gone back into the woods since, not even for a walk. But I never forgot that cabin. I never forgot the cold way he watched me like he already knew how it would end. And I know this much. If I hadn't trusted my gut and left when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. I never thought something as simple as taking a weekend away to clear my head would turn into something so horrifying. It was supposed to be an escape from the everyday noise of my life, a peaceful retreat to a small old cabin in the woods. But the more I think about it now, the more I realize that maybe it wasn't the solitude I was looking for. Maybe I should have stayed home, or at least told someone exactly where I was going. It all started when my cousin, Greg, told me about this cabin in the woods just outside of a small town called Hillbrook. Greg had been there a few times over the past couple of years, but he was one of those people who didn't like to talk about the details. He always kept things vague, like he was guarding some sort of secret. "It's peaceful," he'd say. "Perfect for clearing your head. You should go." First, I didn't think much of it. I was burned out from work and needed a break from everything. So, I packed up my old car, grabbed a few supplies, and headed out. The drive to Hillbrook was long and winding, the kind of road that made you feel like you were being swallowed by the trees on both sides. I'm not used to being out in the woods like this. This was unfamiliar territory, but I liked it. There's something about the deep quiet that settles the mind. After a few hours, I reached the small town of Hillbrook. The place looked like something out of a forgotten postcard. Old buildings, small town charm, a general store with a crooked sign. The locals were kind enough but didn't seem overly eager to talk. That suited me just fine. Greg had given me basic directions to the cabin, but they weren't exactly clear. "It's about 10 miles outside of town," he'd said. "Follow the dirt road past the old mill. The cabin is at the end." I took a deep breath and followed his instructions, my car bouncing along the gravel road, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in as I drove further in. As I got deeper into the woods, something started to feel off. Maybe it was just my nerves. Too much silence after all the noise of city life. But the trees seemed darker here, their trunks gnarled, twisted in ways that looked unnatural. The air was thick and damp, the kind that clung to your skin and made you uncomfortable. Still, I pressed on, convincing myself it was all in my head. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was small, tucked away in a clearing, surrounded by thick brush and trees. It had been abandoned for some time, the wooden walls weathered and worn, the roof covered in moss. The front porch was sagging slightly, but the cabin itself looked intact. It wasn't much, but that was fine. I didn't need much to relax. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and stepped out onto the creaky wooden porch. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. I took a moment to let it all sink in, the isolation, the peace of being so far removed from everything. I unlocked the door with the key Greg had left for me and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was simple, just the way I liked it. A fireplace, a small kitchen, a couple of chairs, and a table. There was a bedroom at the back, the bed covered in an old, faded quilt. It had that musty, abandoned smell, but nothing too unbearable. I opened the windows to let some fresh air in, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that still lingered. I spent the first evening settling in, making dinner, reading a book, and enjoying the silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the woods outside seemed to darken even more. The sound of distant rustling, maybe animals moving through the underbrush, was the only thing that broke the stillness. By the time night fell, I was ready to go to bed. I turned off the lights, got into bed, and pulled the quilt up to my chin. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind blew through the trees, but nothing out of the ordinary. I closed my eyes, ready for a good night's sleep. But then I heard something, a faint sound from outside. It was hard to pinpoint, like the rustling of leaves, but then there was a thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I lay there in the darkness, heart racing. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or maybe a bear. I wasn't exactly familiar with the wildlife here, but I knew that some of the animals could make strange noises. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again. A scraping noise, slow and deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin. My instincts told me to stay still, to not make a sound. I listened closely, trying to figure out what it was. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was just outside the window. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a sharp, heavy knock on the wall near the window, and I froze. I couldn't move. I didn't want to look, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? What did they want? The knocking stopped. I waited, barely breathing. A few minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I felt my muscles tense, my body ready to react, but I had no idea what to do. The silence was unbearable. I cautiously moved toward the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. Nothing, just the darkness of the woods outside. The knocking had stopped, but I wasn't convinced it was over. Whoever or whatever had been outside was still out there, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided I needed to check around the cabin, but I didn't want to go outside just yet. So I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my boots, and slowly made my way around the inside, looking through the cracks in the walls. The cabin was small enough that there weren't many places to hide, but I checked each one anyway. Nothing. Still, the tension in the air felt thick, suffocating. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, too alert to relax. I kept the light on in the bedroom, the only source of comfort in the oppressive darkness. The hours crawled by, but eventually, the sun started to rise, casting a pale light through the trees. I didn't feel much better, but the daylight helped calm my nerves. I decided to leave the cabin for a while, take a walk, maybe get some fresh air and shake off the weird feeling from the night before. The woods seemed quieter in the morning, peaceful even. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After an hour of walking, I started to feel like I needed to turn back. I hadn't seen anything strange, but the air was too still, the woods too silent. I turned around, but that's when I saw it. Something moving in the distance. It was a figure walking between the trees, too far away for me to see clearly but close enough to make me freeze. I stood still, watching, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, like it was searching for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to run, my legs carrying me back toward the cabin as fast as they would go. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, and the more I ran, the more I felt like I was getting further from safety. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were looking for something. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking the windows, peeking through the curtains, keeping a tight grip on the flashlight. The sense of dread didn't leave me. It only grew stronger as nightfall approached again. This time, I wasn't going to let myself get caught off guard. I made sure to lock all the doors and windows before the sun dipped below the trees. I set up a chair by the window, determined to keep watch, waiting for anything to happen. It was well after midnight when I saw him again, the figure from earlier moving between the trees just outside the cabin. But this time he was closer, much closer. He was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was afraid that even the slightest sound would alert him to my presence. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, packed my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't go back to the cabin. I don't know what it was or who that man was. Maybe he was just another person looking for peace and quiet in the woods, but I didn't stick around to find out. As I drove back into town, I passed the general store and saw the owner outside. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just nodded, as if he already knew I wasn't coming back. Maybe I'll never know what happened at that cabin. Maybe some things are better left unexplained. But one thing is for certain, I'll never go back to Hillbrook, and I'll never look for peace in the woods again. My name's Andrew Foster. I was 36 years old when this happened. I lived in a small town in southern Oregon called Maple Hill. Population was around 900, give or take. The kind of place where people don't lock their doors at night and know their neighbors by name. I worked from home, web development, mostly contract jobs, and lived alone since my divorce a few years earlier. I had a dog, a mutt named Riley, and I kept to myself more than I probably should have. That fall, I decided to rent a small place outside of town for a couple weeks, just to get some peace and quiet. I was behind on a big client project and couldn't concentrate at home. Too many distractions. So I went on a rental site and found something odd but interesting. A short, squat little glass cabin out in the woods, about 40 minutes from town, right along the edge of some private forest land near Mount McLaughlin. It wasn't a full cabin, really, more like a box. The listing described it as a minimalist design, immersive forest experience. And from the photos, it looked like a cube of black steel and thick, tempered glass on all sides, about 1 story tall, maybe 10 feet high. The whole thing was modern and weird, but somehow beautiful. One main room with a bed, desk, wood stove, and small kitchenette. The bathroom was tucked into a corner behind a frosted glass wall. It wasn't exactly what I'd imagined, but it seemed perfect. Quiet, remote, cold nights, forest sounds, a chance to reset. I booked it for 15 nights. I packed up a few things, mostly clothes, food, my laptop, a few books, and drove out on a Sunday morning in late October. Riley rode up front with me, head out the window the whole way. The drive was pretty uneventful. We passed through a lot of pine forests and gravel roads, then followed a narrow private access trail for about a mile before reaching a wide clearing where the cabin stood. It was just like the pictures. A low black cube, all walls of glass except for the base and the ceiling, which were solid. It looked almost like it didn't belong there. Too sharp, too new. Like it had dropped out of the sky into a place it wasn't supposed to be. There was no cell signal at all. No bars. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had downloaded everything I needed for work, and there was a little landline phone inside that could be used for emergencies. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just a wood stove, a propane range, and a solar battery setup for lights and power. I unloaded my bags, brought Riley in, and got settled. He sniffed everything a little too intensely, but that was normal. I made a pot of coffee, set up my laptop at the desk near the glass wall facing the woods, and got to work. The silence was overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much noise I'd gotten used to back in town. That first day and night were uneventful. Cold, quiet, exactly what I'd wanted. I woke up the next morning with frost edging the lower part of the glass walls. It was a little unnerving being surrounded by glass at night, even with the privacy shades down. but I reminded myself there was nobody around for miles. The closest neighbor, according to the listing, was 4 miles down the mountain. By the third night, I had gotten into a routine. Wake up, coffee, work, short walk with Riley, dinner, bed. It was the fourth night when things started to feel strange. It was just after 2 a.m. I had woken up to Riley growling low in his throat. Not barking, not whining, just this low, steady growl. He was sitting upright on the bed, staring out the east-facing glass wall that looked into the trees. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and looked where he was looking. It was pitch black outside, but the moon was out and gave the forest a silver sheen. I didn't see anything. Nothing moved. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, even though I had a habit of thinking out loud despite being alone. I patted Riley, but he wouldn't lay back down. He just kept staring. That night, I didn't really fall back asleep. The next day, I brushed it off. Maybe he smelled something. Fox, maybe. He was on edge for most of the morning, pacing, ears twitching. I took him for a longer walk down the path that led to the creek about a quarter mile behind the cabin, hoping to calm him down. It seemed to help, but the next night, same thing. This time it was closer to 1:30 a.m. Riley didn't growl, he barked. A single loud bark that made me sit up straight in bed. He was pressed against the glass wall on the north side, tail straight, staring hard. His ears were pinned back. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and looked out the glass. Again, I saw nothing. No movement, no sound. The forest was dead silent. That silence stuck with me. I'd spent a lot of time in the woods over the years. There are always sounds. Crickets, branches moving, birds. But that night, nothing. Just stillness and Riley's quiet, nervous breathing. The fifth day, I started to feel like I wasn't alone out there. It was subtle, just that creeping sense in the back of your neck that something's off. I kept working, but I was distracted. I'd glance out the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see something standing just beyond the tree line. I didn't see anything all day, but that night I did. It was late, probably close to 3 a.m. I'd given up trying to sleep and was reading by the soft yellow lamp near the bed. Riley had finally dozed off. The moon was out again. I glanced up at the glass facing the east woods, and I saw a man. He was standing maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees, not moving, just standing there. He wasn't wearing anything unusual. Looked like jeans, a heavy jacket, maybe a hood pulled over. I couldn't see his face. He wasn't walking, wasn't carrying anything, just standing. Still, I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Riley hadn't seen him yet. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to move and draw attention, but I also couldn't just sit there. I reached slowly for the small axe I kept near the firewood bin and pulled it onto the bed. I watched the man for a long time, at least 10, 15 minutes. He didn't move an inch. Eventually, I blinked, and he was gone, just gone, like he stepped behind a tree or dropped to the ground. I waited until sunrise before going outside. I took Riley with me and walked slowly to where I thought I saw the man. There was nothing.
No footprints. No cigarette butts.
No signs anyone had been there. The ground was dry, a little crunchy with frost, and there should have been something, but there wasn't. I told myself it was my imagination. Just nerves, isolation, lack of sleep. I wanted to believe that, but Riley wouldn't go past that tree line all morning. He just stood near the cabin door, staring out, tail stiff. The next few nights, I barely slept. I kept the axe in bed with me. Riley stayed close. I started noticing little things during the day, too, like items in the cabin weren't quite where I'd left them. My coat on the wrong hook. A dish out of place. I thought maybe I was just losing it from being alone. I almost packed up and left, but I was too stubborn. The ninth night, everything changed. Started the same, cold, quiet, frost on the glass. But around 2 a.m., I heard a sound I hadn't heard before. Footsteps, crunching, slow, deliberate, outside the cabin. Riley started growling, low, deep. He stood up and stared at the south wall. I grabbed the axe and moved to the side of the bed. Then I saw him, the same man, standing just feet from the glass right outside, looking in. He didn't move, didn't try to come in, just stared. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could feel him watching. I stood there for minutes, maybe longer. Then I backed up, went into the corner behind the frosted glass bathroom wall, and waited, axe in hand. I didn't dare close my eyes. I didn't sleep that night at all. By morning, he was gone. I went outside. Again, no tracks, no signs of anything. That day, I called the property owner from the landline and told him someone was out here. He said it was impossible, nobody else had access to the land. He suggested maybe a hunter, but that didn't make sense. No gun, no orange, and no reason to get that close without saying something. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, but that night it escalated. Around midnight, I heard something scrape the glass. Not loud, but enough to jolt me up. Riley was already barking by the time I got to my feet. I flicked on the lights and saw a smear, something oily or greasy, streaked across the glass wall. A handprint. It was a small handprint, too small for a man his size. I felt something snap inside me. I packed everything in a rush. I barely slept. I left at first light. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I drove straight back to town, white-knuckling the wheel the whole way. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He sounded rattled. Said he went out to inspect the cabin and found a piece of cloth, part of a jacket, stuck in the brush near the east wall. There was blood on it. He turned it over to the local sheriff, but I never heard anything else. I never went back. I moved a few months later, sold my place in Maple Hill and started over in a new city. I still think about the man by the glass cabin sometimes, about how long he might have been watching before I ever saw him, about what would have happened if the walls hadn't been glass, or if I hadn't left when I did. I still have the axe. I keep it by my bed, just in case. In the fall of 1987, I was 28 and unemployed. I quit my job at the auto parts plant in Joliet because the hours were awful, and I hated the supervisor. I thought I could find something better in Indianapolis, where my cousin Rick lived, but nothing panned out. By October, my money had nearly run out. I didn't want to crawl back home to Mom and Dad, and Rick's patience was wearing thin. That's when he reminded me about the old farm our uncle had left behind. It was about 2 hours southeast, near a small town called Hope. Uncle Ray had passed away 5 years earlier, and no one really wanted the place. He had no kids, and my dad didn't want to deal with the property. Rick said it had been just sitting there, unused, with the cabin still standing but worn down. There were a few outbuildings, an overgrown field, and a well. It wasn't a bad idea. I could live there for free and do some odd jobs for cash. I liked being away from people anyway, and the idea of fresh air and quiet was appealing. I drove down there in my rusty '79 Ford Granada on a gray afternoon. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path. Trees started crowding close on both sides, and I could feel the remoteness setting in. The cabin sat in a clearing, low and wide, with weathered wood and a tin roof that looked like it might peel off in the next big storm. The front porch sagged, and vines had started creeping up the sides. To the left was a collapsed barn. To the right, I saw a chicken coop with no chickens. The field behind the house had turned into a waist-high mess of weeds and yellow grass. There was no power, no phone line, and no plumbing aside from the old hand pump well. I had to use a kerosene lamp inside and bring my own water for a while until I could clean out the well. It was rough, but I figured it was just temporary. I settled in that week. My days were quiet. I cleared out the brush around the porch, chopped firewood from a fallen tree out back, and patched up the worst holes in the roof. Inside the cabin, there was a wood stove, a cot, and a few old cabinets with rusted hinges. I swept the place out, nailed a few loose boards down, and tried not to think about the mice I heard at night in the walls. At first, I liked the quiet. I liked waking up and hearing birds, walking to the edge of the woods and just watching deer move through the trees. It felt like I was finally doing something for myself. But by the second week, I started noticing things. It began with sounds. One night, while lying on the cot under 2 heavy blankets, I heard a short, sharp knocking. Not at the door. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin. 3 knocks, then nothing. I figured it was a branch from a nearby tree tapping in the wind. But the next night, there were no gusts and the knocking happened again 3 times. Same spot. I went outside with my flashlight and looked. The tree closest to that side of the cabin had been cut years ago, and its stump was too far to be touching the house. There was nothing there but bare ground. The next morning, I checked again. Still nothing. No tracks, no branches, no animals. A few days later, I found deep scratches in the dirt near the side of the well. They weren't from a shovel or rake. They looked like claw marks, too wide for a dog or raccoon. I thought maybe a bear had come by, but I hadn't seen any in the area and no other signs, no tracks, no scat, nothing. It got worse. One night, maybe 1:30 in the morning, I woke up sweating. I'd stoked the fire before bed, but it wasn't warm. I sat up and listened. The wind was gone. No night birds.
No crickets.
Just silence. Then I heard footsteps. Not fast. Not running. Just slow, steady steps moving across the porch.
He said frozen.
I hadn't locked the door. I rarely did. It didn't feel like someone walking up to knock or pass by. It was someone pacing, like they were walking back and forth along the porch. I waited, heart pounding, then finally reached for the axe I kept near the cot and quietly moved to the door. I opened it fast. There was nothing, no one, but the old boards on the porch creaked when I stepped out, and they'd been creaking before I opened the door. I spent the rest of the night awake, axe in hand. The next day, I checked around the property. I found nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt. No scuff marks on the porch. I even checked the woods behind the cabin, but I found nothing unusual. I thought maybe I was just on edge. Living alone like that does things to your mind, especially when there's no one to talk to. But things didn't stop. Later that week, I hiked out farther to find the old fencing along the edge of the property. I figured if I cleaned it up, I could maybe use the field for something. As I walked through a gap in the trees, I found something I hadn't seen before, a shed. It wasn't visible from the cabin. The roof was half caved in, and the door hung open on a single hinge. Inside, it smelled like mold and rot. Tools hung on rusted nails. Old cans of paint and oil sat on shelves. What caught my eye, though, was a pile of burlap sacks in the corner, tied off at the top with twine. There were 6 of them, each about the size of a basketball. I poked one with a stick. It made a soft, dry sound, like leaves shifting. When I cut one open with my knife, the smell hit me first. Old meat, dirt, and something chemical. Inside were bones. Small bones. Not animal. Not from a deer or a pig. They looked like hands. Child-sized. I dropped the sack and stumbled outside. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was something old, a prank, even a forgotten burial from a time when people did strange things with the dead on farms. I wanted to believe anything but the worst. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove into Hope to try and ask someone about the shed. At the general store, I mentioned the old farm. When I said it belonged to Ray Nichols, the old man behind the counter just looked at me for a second, then rang up my stuff without saying anything. The silence was heavier than words. I decided not to push it. That night, I moved the cot in front of the door and kept the axe closer. Just after 2 a.m., I heard the knocking again, this time on the front of the cabin. Then the porch creaked, and I swear I heard breathing. Not mine. It was close.
Bet.
Shaky. I held my breath and didn't move. After a few minutes, it stopped. When I opened the door at dawn, I found prints. Not shoes, not boots, bare feet, thin, long toes. The prints circled the cabin. I don't know why I didn't leave then. Maybe I was too scared. Maybe I thought if I left, whatever it was might follow me. But I knew something was wrong, really wrong. The next day, I returned to the shed to take another look. All the sacks were gone. I stood there, staring at the corner where they had been. The dirt was disturbed, but there were no drag marks.
No footprints.
I backed out and didn't go near it again. That night, I kept the lamp burning. Just after midnight, I heard a sound outside that I can only describe as chewing, wet and slow. It was followed by the sound of something being dragged. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, axe in hand, waiting. At dawn, I found another set of prints, leading from the woods to the well. Near the well's edge, the earth was loose. I walked over slowly and looked down. The cover I'd placed over it, a metal sheet with a cinder block on top, had been pulled off and thrown aside. Something had gone down there. I didn't bother packing. I got in the car and drove until the gas tank was almost empty. I never went back. I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I say? That I'd found sacks of bones? That something barefoot walked around at night and chewed things it found near my cabin? I stayed with a friend in Fort Wayne for a few weeks and then found a job in Ohio. I tried to forget about it. 3 years later, I heard that the shed had collapsed completely in a storm. The cabin burned down the following winter, cause unknown. The whole farm was bulldozed in 1991, and now it's just forest again. But sometimes I still hear that slow, wet chewing in my dreams, and I wake up thinking about those burlap sacks, wondering if there had been more, wondering if someone else had lived there long before Uncle Ray, doing things no one ever talked about. All I know is, whatever it was, it didn't want me there, and I didn't need to be told twice. I was 39 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late autumn 2014. I'd just gone through a bad stretch, divorce, long hours at work, and my health was starting to feel the pressure. I didn't want to be around people, not even family. I'd spent the last 10 years managing a small construction firm in Leeds, and it had worn me down. There was always something breaking, someone calling in sick, or clients dragging their feet on payments. The last thing I needed was more talking. So I booked a cabin in Northumberland, near the Scottish border. I found it through a friend of a friend who owned a few rural properties. This one was older, tucked away past a long gravel road that had no proper signposts. It had once belonged to an old shepherd, then sat unused for nearly 2 decades until someone fixed it up just enough to rent out. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a generator, a fireplace, a gas stove, and a bed. The kind of place where even the phone signal dies if you walk more than 10 feet inside. Perfect. The cabin sat near the edge of Kielder Forest, down a narrow dirt road off the main track. The last half mile was thick with trees, and when I pulled up in my car, I couldn't even see the sky anymore. The forest swallowed the road whole. The air was colder than back home. The tree branches bent low, their tips brushing my car as I passed. It was already near dusk, and the silence outside was complete. No birds, no wind, nothing. I unpacked in a rush. I brought enough supplies for a week. Food, firewood, a few books, a camping lantern, and a radio with fresh batteries. The cabin itself was small, Just one big room with a fireplace, a narrow kitchen along the wall, and a door leading to a toilet that flushed into a compost pit out back. No shower, just a basin and a bucket. I didn't care. I wanted quiet. The first 2 days were peaceful. I woke with the sun, went for short walks on the trails nearby, then came back to read by the fire. I barely looked at my phone. It didn't matter. I didn't want to talk to anyone anyway. On the third day, I noticed something off. I was outside, stacking more wood by the cabin wall. There was a hill slope just beyond the backside of the cabin, covered in thick bracken and low brush, and beyond that, the forest stretched on for miles. That afternoon, I thought I saw someone up there, a figure about 50 yards away, standing still between the trees. She didn't move. I thought it might have been a hunter or maybe a hiker, but it was strange because she wasn't wearing anything bright or reflective, just a long, dark coat. She had black hair tied back, I think. She was facing my way, but it was hard to tell. I stood there staring for about 30 seconds. Then I blinked, and she was gone. I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the way the shadows moved when the wind pushed the branches around. Maybe I'd stared too long at the fire that morning and my eyes were playing up. Either way, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I made coffee on the gas stove and stepped out to check the trail behind the cabin. The air smelled like frost, though it hadn't snowed yet. I walked for about an hour, sticking to the narrow path that cut through the brush. There were deer tracks in the mud and old stumps with moss grown over them like soft green blankets. Peaceful again. But as I headed back, I saw something that stopped me. Near the edge of the trail, in a dip where the ground dipped low and pooled with rainwater, there were boot prints. 2 sets. One was mine from earlier that week. I recognized the tread. The other was smaller, narrower, like a woman's boot. The prints came down from the hill slope, met mine, then turned off deeper into the woods. I stood there a long time staring at them. Something about it made me cold, like I was being watched again. That night, I locked the cabin door, though I didn't feel like locks mattered much out there. The windows had no curtains, just dusty wooden shutters that didn't quite close properly. I pulled my sleeping bag into the corner by the fireplace and left the lantern burning low. Around 2 a.m., I heard something on the porch, a soft creak, then another, like someone had stepped onto the wood. I froze. The fire had gone down to glowing embers, but the room was still warm. I didn't move. I just lay there, my breath shallow, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. I heard it again, a slow dragging noise, not footsteps, more like something being pulled across the boards. I waited. It stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were no marks,
No footprints.
but the corner of the doormat had been moved, just slightly, curled up like it had been kicked. I couldn't prove it wasn't wind, but I knew it hadn't been like that the day before. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was letting the isolation get to me, that I'd spent too long in cities and wasn't used to the sounds of nature. But deep down, I didn't believe that. By day 5, I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept the fire going and left the generator off so there wasn't any hum. I wanted to hear if anything came close. I carried the camping lantern with me everywhere, even during the day. I started hearing small noises at night. Clicks, branches breaking, faint knocking sounds that didn't belong. Then that evening I saw her again. It was right before sunset. I was sitting on the small bench outside the cabin, drinking tea and trying to calm myself down. The trees had gone that deep reddish-orange from the late afternoon light. That's when I saw movement near the edge of the slope. She came out from behind a tree, slowly, like she didn't care if I saw her. She was wearing the same dark coat, but now I could see her more clearly. Her face was pale, too pale for someone who'd been outside. Her eyes were fixed on me, not blinking. She didn't speak or wave, just stood there. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't say anything, just backed slowly toward the door. She didn't move. I stepped inside, locked the door, and looked out through the cracks between the shutters. She was still there. I stood like that for almost 10 minutes, watching through the tiny slit. Then she turned, slowly, and walked back into the woods. I didn't go outside again that night. I didn't eat. I sat in the corner with a piece of firewood in my hands like a bat. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I was done. I packed my bags, grabbed the cooler, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't care if I'd paid for a week. I was leaving. I threw everything into the boot and got in the car. But the road back wasn't right. About half a mile from the cabin, I came to a fallen tree, a thick pine, completely blocking the track. It hadn't been there before. No way. I would have noticed something that size. It hadn't stormed. It hadn't even rained. This tree didn't fall on its own. I got out, looked around. There were no tracks.
No drag marks.
Just the tree across the path like it had been dropped there. Couldn't move it. It was too big. The axe in the cabin might have helped, but I wasn't going back for it. So I turned the car around and drove back to the clearing. I sat there for almost an hour thinking. My phone had no service, of course. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't drive out. I considered walking back to the main road, but it was at least 6 miles, and I didn't want to risk being caught in the woods again at night. Not with her out there. I stayed one more night, just one more. I blocked the door with furniture and didn't sleep. I sat there all night, holding the firewood in my hands, staring at the shadows. Nothing came.
No sounds.
But the silence was worse than noise. At first light, I grabbed my pack and left on foot. I followed the trail down past the stream, then across the old logging road I'd seen on one of my walks earlier in the week. It took almost 2 hours, but I finally got to a small petrol station just past the village of Lanehead. They let me use the phone to call a recovery truck and get help clearing the road. When I came back with the truck driver later that afternoon, the fallen tree was gone. Not just moved, gone. There were no branches, no marks in the dirt, no stump. The driver looked at me like I was lying. I didn't explain. I told him to wait while I grabbed my gear from the cabin. I ran in, got the axe, the radio, and a few other things I'd left behind. I locked the door again out of habit and we drove out. I never went back. I don't know who she was. Maybe just a local who liked to scare off outsiders. Maybe someone who lived out there off-grid. But I know she watched me for days. I know she came close enough to step onto the porch. I know she was trying to keep me there. I moved out of Leeds a year later, took a job further south. I don't go camping anymore. I don't rent cabins. And I don't go anywhere where the trees are too thick to see the sky. Sometimes I dream about her, standing there still at the edge of the woods watching, waiting, but I never saw her again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I hadn't had time for a real break in years, and when my friend Marcus suggested a weekend getaway in a remote cabin, I was all for it. The cabin was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town. I didn't know the area well, but I wasn't concerned. It was a small cabin, nothing fancy, just a place to unwind. Marcus had rented it online, and the photos made it look perfect. Rustic, cozy, surrounded by dense forest. Felt like a step back into nature. Marcus and I weren't strangers to the outdoors. We'd gone camping together in the past, but never in a place this secluded. We made our plans, packed our gear, and left early on a Friday morning. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The place looked even better than in the pictures. Simple but charming. A small porch with rocking chairs, a stone chimney, and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin. It was perfect. A tiny creek ran nearby. The sound of water trickling over rocks added to the peacefulness of the place. But something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I shrugged it off as just nerves, the kind of feeling you get when you're in a new place. Marcus, being the more laid-back of the two of us, didn't seem bothered. He immediately started unloading the truck. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace, cracked open a couple of beers, and enjoyed the silence. The only sounds came from the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. We talked about old times, laughed a lot, and talked about our plans for the weekend. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. The cabin was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. The fire had long since died down to embers, and the only light came from the faint moonlight streaming in through the small windows. I lay still for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I heard it then, scratching. It was faint, almost like the sound of nails dragging across wood. Came from outside. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I waited for a few seconds, but the sound didn't repeat itself. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a raccoon or something. I told myself it was nothing, but then I heard it again. The scratching was louder now, closer to the window. I jumped out of bed and crept toward the window, peering through the curtain. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light outside. I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees and the faint shimmer of the creek. I waited, but the sound didn't come again. My nerves were on edge, but I tried to calm myself. It was just a weird noise. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease. I barely slept, staring at the ceiling, listening for any more strange noises. The next morning, I told Marcus about what happened, but he just laughed it off. "It's probably just a squirrel or something," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're paranoid." We spent the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, and the trail we followed quickly turned into an overgrown path. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We didn't talk much during the hike. Marcus was ahead of me, moving quickly, while I lagged behind, my mind still caught on the strange sounds from the night before. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again. We grabbed more firewood and lit up the hearth, and this time, Marcus cracked open a bottle of whiskey. We drank slowly, the warmth of the fire and the alcohol easing the tension in my body. But that night, the feeling of unease returned with a vengeance. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees outside began to creak and sway, and the air turned colder. We had the windows shut tight, but I could still hear the wind whistling through the cracks. I was sitting by the fire, zoning out, when I heard it again, the scratching. But this time it was louder, more persistent. I froze. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I glanced at Marcus, who was half asleep on the couch. I stood up quietly and walked toward the window, peering outside once again. Nothing. The darkness was impenetrable. I was about to turn back when I saw something move. A shadow. It was brief, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I squinted, but whatever it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow. The wind howled outside, but I could still hear the faint scratching. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and went to the front door. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened it just a crack. The cold air rushed in, and I quickly scanned the porch and the surrounding trees. There was no one there, no sign of movement, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I closed the door and locked it, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a weird branch rubbing against the cabin. But as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I kept my eyes on the window, unable to shake the sensation. Minutes turned into hours, and the feeling only intensified. Marcus was snoring on the couch, oblivious to the tension that had wrapped itself around me. I thought about going to check the truck to see if anything had been tampered with, but the thought of stepping outside alone in the dark made my stomach turn. I tried to distract myself with the fire, but the unease gnawed at me, getting worse with every passing minute. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening outside. I grabbed the keys to the truck and slipped out the back door. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. I walked around to the front of the cabin and shone the flashlight across the porch, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a deep breath and walked further into the yard, toward the creek. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the water, just outside the beam of the flashlight. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The flashlight slipped from my grip and landed on the ground with a clatter, casting a wild beam of light across the trees. The figure didn't move, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't a person, not like I'd ever seen before. There was something off about the way it stood, the way it blended into the darkness like it was part of it. I turned and ran back to the cabin, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, couldn't. When I burst through the door, Marcus woke up, groggy and confused. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, but I couldn't explain. I was out of breath, my mind racing. All I knew was that I wasn't alone out there. We spent the rest of the night inside, both of us wide awake, listening to the wind howl outside. The scratching sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, we packed up and left. Neither of us said much during the drive back, but we both knew something was wrong. We didn't talk about what had happened that night. I didn't need to say it out loud for Marcus to understand. I wasn't going back there. As I looked in the rearview mirror, the cabin seemed to vanish behind the trees, as though it had never existed at all. A small part of me was relieved, but another part of me knew it would always stay with me, the memory of the figure by the creek waiting. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know I'll never go back to that cabin, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, knowing that whatever it was waiting. I was 37 when I inherited the cabin. It was 2022, and I had been working as a diesel mechanic in Newcastle for the better part of 12 years. My uncle, Frank, passed away in the spring. I hadn't seen him in a decade, not since he moved permanently to a piece of land in Northumberland, near the border. They called it near Audubon, but that was generous. It was tucked beyond the hills, closer to the national park, at the far edge of anything most people would still call England. The solicitor called and said Frank had left me the property. I didn't even know he still owned it. It had been built back in the 60s before zoning laws really clamped down, and apparently he'd done most of the renovations himself. The only reason I knew anything about it was because Dad had taken us there once, maybe in 1995. I was 9 or 10. I barely remembered the trip, just a rough road, a fire pit out front, and the damp smell inside that stuck to your clothes for days. But now it was mine. There was no reason to keep it, but I didn't want to sell it without seeing it. So that autumn, I packed my work van with enough gear for a long weekend. Tools, jerry cans, a space heater, food, water, a sleeping bag, and took a Friday off to drive up. The road past Audubon turned to gravel after a while, then narrowed to barely a lane, twisting into the trees. It was one of those roads that clearly hadn't been maintained in years. More pothole than road in some stretches. The cabin was marked on a crumpled map the solicitor had given me, and I found it only after nearly missing the entrance, hidden behind a wall of overgrown brush and a rusted gate lying half-collapsed in the ditch. It didn't look like much from the outside. The roof sagged slightly on one side, the front porch was warped, and the wooden siding had gone gray. But the door was locked, and the windows were unbroken. When I finally forced the door open, the smell hit me hard: damp, earth, and stale air. It looked untouched since he died. A single armchair in front of a cold stove. A narrow hallway leading to 2 rooms. Dust thick enough to write on. I opened every window I could to let in the cold air and swept out the worst of the debris. That first night, I stayed up just taking it in. I found old tins in the pantry, some still sealed, and opened one to find it had been stuffed with cash, banded in 10s and 20s, thousands of pounds. I found maps, receipts, ledgers, all in my uncle's tight handwriting. The man had lived here like a hermit, but that wasn't the part that stuck with me. The next day, I decided to walk the property line. According to the papers, Frank owned 27 acres of land, almost a full ring around the cabin. It was thick forest, mostly pine and some birch, quiet except for the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels or a fox. There were stone markers along the edges, and I followed them with a GPS app just to confirm. I was halfway around when I found something strange. An old shed, about 300 meters from the cabin. It wasn't on the map. The structure looked like it had been built quickly. Rough boards, no paint, with a heavy chain looped around the door handles. It looked wrong. Not just old, but forgotten in a way that made my skin crawl. Like someone had tried to make sure it was never found again. The chain was rusty, but it wasn't broken. And the lock on it was relatively new. Weathered, yes, but not ancient like the rest of the building. I tried pulling it open, but it wouldn't budge. I wasn't about to break in, not with only a claw hammer and a hatchet. I took a photo and walked back to the cabin before the light went. That night, I heard something outside. It was just past midnight. I'd fallen asleep in the armchair by the stove, wrapped in my sleeping bag, when the noise woke me. A soft crunch, like a boot on leaves. Then nothing. Then again closer. I turned off the lamp and sat still. No curtains on the windows, no light outside. Couldn't see a thing. My hand was on the hatchet I'd left beside the chair. I waited. Nothing. I must have sat there for an hour before I finally nodded off again. Next morning, I walked the perimeter again, slower this time. I checked around the shed. No tracks. Nothing to suggest anyone had been near it. I was halfway convinced I'd dreamed it. But then I found something behind the cabin. It was a shovel, not an old one. It looked like it had been used recently. The blade was muddy, freshly muddy, not caked on and dried. It had been leaned carefully against a tree, almost tucked behind the propane tank. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I know I would have. I carried it inside, wiped it down, and sat with it in my lap for a long time. Something wasn't right. Why was there a locked shed in the woods? Why was there fresh mud on a shovel behind an abandoned cabin? I should have left then. I know that now, but I stayed. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I could drive back in the morning, maybe call someone, have the place looked at. That night, I bolted the door, pulled the only piece of furniture, an old table, across it, and slept with the hatchet next to my bag again. I woke to the sound of metal dragging on wood. It was pitch black, but I knew immediately it wasn't a dream. The noise was coming from the front of the cabin, slow, steady scraping. I froze. My hand found the hatchet again. I waited for the sound to repeat. It did. It was the chain on the door. I didn't breathe, didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard the door creak. The bolt held. The table scraped slightly, like pressure was being applied from outside. But the door didn't open. Then silence. I stayed there until the sun came up. When I finally had the courage to move, I opened the door and stepped out. No tracks, no damage, but the shovel was gone. I packed my gear immediately. I didn't care about the cabin, the inheritance, or the cash. I just wanted to get out. The van started on the first try. I drove fast down the trail, back toward the gravel road. But about 2 miles down, I saw something strange. A figure, standing in the trees. He was maybe 50 yards in, just standing, facing the road, motionless. I couldn't see his face, not clearly, but I saw the outline of his clothes, dark jacket, something bulky over one shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't wave, just watched. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I got back to the main road, and I kept driving until I saw a petrol station near the A68. I told the police. They asked the usual questions. Was I sure I'd locked the door? Could the shovel have been left by a hiker? Did I recognize the man? I didn't have answers. I showed them the photos of the shed. They said they'd send someone to look. I gave them the key to the cabin and told them I didn't want it. That was the last I heard. Until a year later. It was October 2023. A detective came to my work. I recognized him instantly, the same guy I'd spoken to at the station. He pulled me aside and asked if I had a few minutes. They'd finally gone to the property. They opened the shed. Inside, they found plastic barrels. 5 of them, sealed. Inside each one was clothing, bones, personal items. They were still waiting on full identification, but 2 of the missing persons matched cases from over 10 years ago. One had vanished while hiking. Another was a forestry contractor. Both had last been seen in the region. They believed my uncle had been involved, maybe more than involved. They found evidence linking him to several other disappearances, though nothing conclusive. Receipts for camping gear he never used. Phone numbers tied to burner phones. Notes with GPS coordinates that led to other areas nearby. They believed he'd been luring people in, possibly killing them, and then someone else had taken over. That was the part that stuck with me. Frank had died in 2022, but one of the barrels had been sealed after that, and the clothing inside matched a woman who'd gone missing in August 2022, for months after he died. They didn't know who did it, or if Frank had been working with someone, but whoever it was, they had returned, and they had used the cabin again. They asked me if I'd seen anything. I told them about the man in the woods, the shovel, the chain, all of it. The detective nodded, wrote it down, and said they'd keep me informed. I never heard from them again. I sold the van. I moved. I don't go hiking. I don't go camping. I don't look at maps. Sometimes I wonder if I was being watched the entire time. If someone knew I was there, maybe they were testing me, waiting to see what I'd do. I think if I had opened that shed, I wouldn't be writing this now. And sometimes, I still dream about the sound of the chain dragging across the wood. It was the summer of 2011 when I decided to take a break from the usual noise and bustle of life and spend a few days at my grandmother's old cabin. The place sat on the edge of a dense, quiet forest in northern Idaho, about a 3-hour drive from Boise. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and the cabin had been empty for years after she passed away. It had always been a place of refuge for me, a sanctuary I could escape to when life became overwhelming. But this time, as I approached the long gravel driveway, something felt different. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs, with a slanted roof and a wide porch that wrapped around one side. It was tucked in behind thick trees, hidden from view unless you were looking closely. The kind of place you could get lost in if you weren't paying attention. I used to love that feeling of being isolated, surrounded only by nature, the kind of isolation where you could hear every little rustle of wind in the trees or the creak of the porch floorboards beneath your feet. I unloaded my gear, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The clouds above were low and gray. A thunderstorm was rolling in. I'd forgotten how quiet it could be out here. The wind picked up as I started to unpack, and for a moment, I thought I heard something in the woods. A sharp crack, like a twig snapping. I froze for a second, trying to tell myself it was just the wind, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued inside. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The furniture was simple, just a few chairs, an old wooden table, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were still remnants of my grandmother's things. Her quilts draped over the couch, a collection of old books on a shelf, a small worn-out rug in front of the fireplace. The place had a comfortable, lived-in feel even though no one had really lived there for some time. I spent the next few hours settling in, rearranging a few things, making sure the wood stove worked, and cleaning up a little. The storm had arrived, and the wind began to howl outside. The rain pounded the roof, creating a rhythmic drumming sound. It was peaceful in its own way, but as the evening wore on, the storm only seemed to grow stronger. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint knock, like a tap on the door. I figured it was just the wind, maybe the branches of the trees scraping against the cabin. But then the knocks came again, this time more insistent. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. Then I made my way to the door, slowly, cautiously. When I opened it, no one was there. I stood there for a while, looking out into the dark, rain-slicked night. The trees were swaying violently in the wind. The rain so heavy it made it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The sound of the storm was deafening, but in the silence that followed the knock, I could almost feel something or someone watching me. I wasn't sure what it was, but I closed the door and bolted it shut. The rest of the night passed in a strange haze. I made some dinner, sat by the fire, read a few chapters of a book I found on the shelf, and tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I chalked it up to the storm and the isolation, convincing myself that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. But as I lay down to sleep, I heard it again, the sound of something scratching at the door. I couldn't bring myself to get up that time. I buried my head in the pillow, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The scratching grew louder, almost frantic. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up, listening intently. It wasn't the wind this time, I was sure of it. It was something or someone out there. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and slowly crept to the door. My mind was racing, my thoughts spinning with possibilities. Maybe it was a wild animal or some local kids playing a prank. But the storm was so fierce that I couldn't imagine anyone being out there. Still, I wasn't about to take any chances. I opened the door, shining the flashlight out into the dark. There was nothing. I stepped outside, scanning the area with the beam of light, my breath visible in the cold air. The rain had eased slightly, but the wind was still relentless, whipping the trees around me. I could hear nothing but the roar of the storm. I waited there for a moment, my senses on edge, but the more I stood there, the more I began to feel foolish. There was no one here. It was just the storm, playing tricks on my mind. I went back inside and locked the door, trying to shake the unease from my mind. I spent the rest of the night in fits of restless sleep, every sound outside making me jump, every crack of thunder causing my heart to race. The next morning, I decided to get some fresh air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick mist that hung low over the forest. The air smelled fresh, and the ground was soft beneath my boots as I made my way toward the nearby creek. I had forgotten how beautiful it was out here, the way the trees towered over everything, their branches heavy with rain. The world felt still and quiet, almost too quiet. As I walked along the creek, I noticed something unusual. Footprints. Large, muddy prints leading off the trail and into the dense brush. They were too big to be human, but not quite like anything I'd seen from animals in the area. The shape of them was off, the depth strange, as though something heavy had passed through. I stopped for a moment, staring at the prints. The unease from the night before came flooding back. I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the prints for a while, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be out here, what might have left them. But the deeper I went, the more the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustling in the trees, followed by a faint grunt. I froze, every muscle tensing. It was the sound of something large moving through the woods. My heart started to race. I wasn't alone. I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin, quickening my pace. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I had just heard. A bear? A moose? Maybe something else? The more I thought about it, the more the logical explanations seemed to fall apart. When I got back to the cabin, I immediately checked the windows and locked all the doors. I knew I was being paranoid, but the unease had settled deep in my bones. I kept thinking about the prints, the noise, the way I felt like something was lurking just out of sight. That night, I decided to leave. The feeling of being watched had become overwhelming, and the stormy night from before seemed to hang over everything. As I packed up my things, I noticed something strange. My grandmother's old quilt, the one she always kept folded on the couch, was missing. I searched the cabin, but it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I left the cabin in a hurry, my heart pounding as I made my way back to the car. I didn't know what had happened, what had been lurking in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to understand. The drive back to Boise felt like a blur, the world outside my window a rush of trees and rain. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I couldn't wait to get out of the car, to be in the safety of my own home. Years later, I would return to that cabin, but it was never the same. The unease, the feeling of being watched, never really left me. The cabin remained a place of memories, but some memories are better left untouched. It was the winter of 2014 when I accepted the post at Flat Pine Reserve in northern Idaho. I was 34 back then, just a few months into a divorce, and all I wanted was silence. No city noise, no social gatherings, no forced smiles. Just trees, snow, and my own damn thoughts. Flat Pine wasn't a glamorous park. It was a patch of wild land about 60 miles from the nearest town, spread across mountains, frozen lakes, and dense conifer forest. Visitors were few and far between, especially in the winter months. That suited me fine. The cabin they assigned me was basic, a little wooden structure near the south end of the park, with a narrow gravel road leading up from the highway. Most of the time, it was snowed in. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just a landline for emergency calls and a radio to check in with the main office every few days. I arrived there on December 3rd, 2014. I remember that date because the first snow of the season came down hard that afternoon, and I barely got the truck up to the cabin before the tires started slipping. After hauling my gear inside and lighting the propane heater, I sat down and felt that strange mixture of peace and loneliness settle in. The job wasn't hard. I had to monitor snowfall, keep an eye out for landslides, make sure no hunters or off-season hikers trespassed, and track any signs of wildlife activity. Occasionally, the Forestry Service would radio me to go check on a downed tree or scout a blocked access road. But for the most part, it was just daily routines. Wake up, boil coffee, walk the trails, log my findings, eat, sleep, repeat. The cabin had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a desk with park maps spread out, and a radio mounted on the wall above it. Behind the cabin, a shed held tools, shovels, and a generator that kicked in during outages. I had 2 rifles, a park-issued .308 and my own .22. Not for show. We had bears. We had wolves. And once in a while, people were the real threat. The first few weeks passed without much to note. A few elk carcasses picked clean by coyotes. One set of snowshoe tracks near the boundary fence, likely a poacher who turned around. I kept the fire going most nights and read old books I found in the cabin.
No weird noises. No strange sightings.
It was just me and the wind. That changed around New Year's. Started small. On January 2nd, I was checking the perimeter fence line on the West Trail, about 3 miles out, when I noticed something off. There were boot prints in the snow. Not snowshoes, not hunting boots. They looked like standard hiking boots, maybe a size 10 or 11. They followed the fence for a few hundred feet and then vanished into the trees. No return tracks. I stood there for a while, just looking. The prints weren't deep, but they were fresh, maybe an hour or 2 old. The wind hadn't blown over them yet. I followed them. They went downhill toward the ravine, zigzagging through the undergrowth. About 200 yards in, I came across something strange. A pile of small stones, arranged in a perfect circle, maybe 3 feet wide. Not natural. The snow inside the circle had been cleared away. In the center, there was a dead bird, some kind of hawk. Neck snapped clean. No blood, just placed there like a decoration. I didn't touch it. I backed out of the trees, went straight to the cabin, and called it in. The supervisor on the other end didn't say much. Probably figured it was just some backwoods hermit screwing around. I logged it and moved on. The next few days were quiet again. No new tracks. The weather dipped into the negatives, and I spent more time inside. But I started locking the cabin door at night. Something about that circle, it had been too careful, too planned. You don't find that kind of thing by accident. A week later, I saw smoke. It was early morning, and I was filling out snow depth reports by the window when I saw a thin column of smoke rising from the trees to the northeast, maybe a mile out. Not a fire, more like someone had built a campfire. That wasn't supposed to happen. I strapped on my snowshoes, grabbed the .308, and hiked toward it. Took about an hour to reach the spot. No trail, just thick forest and drifts up to my knees. When I got there, the fire was already dying out. Someone had made a ring of stones, burned some pine wood, and left behind what looked like the remains of a rabbit. Skinned, bones charred, no sign of the person who made it. Just boot tracks again, same pattern as before. This time, the prints circled around the fire before heading off to the west. I followed them for maybe half a mile before they stopped at a frozen creek bed. No prints on the other side. Nothing, like the person had disappeared. I turned back. That night, I heard the first sound. It was around 2 a.m., and I was half awake, drifting in and out of sleep with the heater running on low. I heard a crunch, just one, like a boot on frozen snow. Then nothing. I sat up and held my breath, listening. No footsteps, no animals moving, just dead quiet. But I know what I heard. Next morning, I found boot prints just 10 feet from the back door. No prints leading to them. Just a few standing there in the snow like someone had walked up and stood behind the cabin. Watching, I radioed again. This time I was firm. I told the main office I thought someone was squatting in the park. Maybe unstable, maybe dangerous. They said they'd send someone up the next supply run, which wouldn't be for another 5 days. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made my nerves jump. Wind against the window, trees creaking, a branch falling off the roof. I sat up with the rifle across my lap until the sun came up. The next day, I did a full sweep of the area, starting with the treeline. I found nothing.
No prints.
No signs of a camp, just cold silence, until I came back to the cabin. The front door was unlocked. Now, I know I locked it. I always did, but it wasn't kicked in.
No marks.
Just turned and left ajar. Nothing inside was missing. Nothing moved, except one thing. The radio was turned off. Not broken, just switched off. And the channel knob was turned to static. I checked every inch of that cabin. I even opened the floor hatch to the crawl space and shined a light down there. Nothing, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Not to steal, just to show me they could. The days blurred after that. I started carrying the .308 everywhere, even indoors. I moved a heavy table in front of the door at night. The radio stayed on 24/7. I checked in every 12 hours instead of every 48. I stopped walking the full trails, just stayed close, waited for the supply truck. It didn't come. January 18th. It was supposed to show up that morning with food, propane, and a new chainsaw blade. I waited by the road until late afternoon, but nothing came up the pass. I tried the radio, static, no signal. I reset the generator, checked the cables. Still nothing. The landline was dead too. That night, I heard footsteps on the roof. Not snow, not branches. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Someone walked the full length of the cabin, stopped above the bedroom, and then walked back again. I froze, rifle aimed at the ceiling. I didn't move for hours. Around dawn, I finally opened the door and looked outside. No prints on the roof, but I found a single glove in the snow. Black leather, size large, still warm inside. On January 19th, I made the call. I packed up essentials, strapped on my snowshoes, and started hiking toward the ranger station 50 miles away. It would take 2 days if I moved fast, but I wasn't staying in that cabin another night. Not alone. I only made it 10 miles before I found the truck. It was off the side of the road, halfway down a ravine. The front end smashed against a tree. No tire tracks leading away, just a single door open and the interior empty. Blood on the driver's seat. A trail leading into the woods. I didn't follow it. I ran back to the cabin. I locked the doors, nailed them shut from the inside, and waited. By the 21st, the radio came back. A crackled voice from the forestry station said the snowstorm had knocked out the repeater tower and they were just getting back online. I told them everything. By the 23rd, a helicopter came. They found me pale, half-starved, with boards still across the windows. I filed the report. The supply driver was never found. They searched the woods for a week. Nothing. Not even the glove I turned in. They asked if I wanted to finish the winter. I didn't. I moved back to Missoula, took a desk job with the Forestry Service, filed papers, tracked weather, never went back to Flat Pine. The official report said it was likely a transient, maybe ex-military, living off the grid. Dangerous, sure, but not enough proof to press on. They shut the cabin down the next year, called it logistical efficiency. Sometimes I wonder who he was, or how long he had been there before I showed up. Watching, testing, picking at the edges, and sometimes I still hear footsteps on the roof in my dreams. I took a week off in September 2019. I was 35, living in Great Falls, Montana, and I'd spent the better part of the last year buried in software deadlines and meetings that drained the life out of me. I hadn't taken a break in over a year, and it was starting to show, mentally and physically. The stress had bled into my sleep, and I'd catch myself grinding my teeth during Zoom calls or snapping at the smallest things. I live alone except for my dog, Tank, a 7-year-old German Shepherd I adopted from a rescue center 5 years earlier. He's big but quiet, fiercely loyal, and one of the few parts of my life that doesn't feel temporary or superficial. The plan was simple: a full week off-grid at a friend's uncle's cabin. Deep in the mountains, no internet, no phone signal, just me, Tank, and the woods. I needed that disconnection more than anything. The cabin was about 3 hours west of Helena, tucked along a faded service trail near the Little Belt Mountains. I'd never been there before, but I trusted my friend when he said it was isolated and peaceful. It belonged to his uncle who'd passed away a few years earlier. No one in the family used it anymore, so it just sat there collecting dust. I packed up everything: dry food, water jugs, a propane stove, first aid kits, bear spray, even a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't naive about the woods. I wasn't looking for some survivalist adventure either. I just wanted to breathe fresh air, listen to the wind in the trees, and maybe hike a little. Tank was happy as long as he had space to run and something to sniff. We drove out early on a Sunday morning. The weather was crisp, the leaves starting to change. The further I got from town, the more relaxed I felt. By the time I turned off the paved road and started up the gravel trail toward the cabin, I felt like I could finally exhale. The cabin looked exactly how you'd expect an old Montana hunting shack to look: single story, built from thick logs with a rusting metal roof and a narrow front porch sagging under its own weight. There was a small shed beside it and an outhouse down a path behind the trees. No neighbors, no sounds but the wind and birds. Just perfect. I unloaded everything, let Tank run around, then walked through the cabin with a flashlight. Smelled old but not bad. Dusty furniture, an old wood stove in the corner, a table with rusted utensils still in the drawer, and a bed in the back room with an actual spring mattress. Mice had probably come and gone, but it was clean enough. The windows were all intact, and the door had a deadbolt. That was enough for me. The first day passed easy. I cooked some rice and sausage on the propane burner, fed Tank, then sat outside with a book until the sun dropped behind the ridge. It got cold fast after dark, so I lit a fire in the wood stove, crawled into the sleeping bag, and fell asleep with Tank curled at my feet. The second day, we explored the area. There was a game trail behind the cabin that led up toward the ridge. Tank kept darting ahead, ears perked, tail wagging, nose buried in leaves and dirt. I had a small day pack with some water, a knife, and my bear spray just in case. We hiked for maybe 3 hours, up and back, and didn't see another soul. That night, something felt a little off. It wasn't anything dramatic. There wasn't a scream or footsteps outside. It was more like a tension in the air, like the woods had gone quiet in a way they hadn't the night before. I remember noticing that the crickets had stopped, which struck me as strange because it was still warm enough. Tank kept looking toward the window. He wasn't barking or growling, just alert. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around. Still, I shut the front door tighter, locked it, and moved my pack closer to the bed. The next day, Tank didn't want to leave the cabin. That was unusual. Normally, I had to leash him to stop him from running off into the trees, but that morning he sat by the door and just stared outside. He was quiet, but I could tell he was tense. His ears kept twitching, and every time a branch cracked or a bird fluttered by, he'd look sharply toward it and stay still. I took him out anyway, hoping a little movement would help. We didn't go far. We barely made it past the trail before he stopped and turned around. Not in a scared way, more like he was saying, "No, not today." I gave up and went back inside. Maybe he smelled a bear or something. I kept the bear spray close that day, even when I was inside. By the fourth night, I wasn't sleeping well. Something about the cabin had shifted. It felt like we weren't alone out there anymore. Again, there was no clear reason. No footsteps, no lights in the woods. But Tank was no longer resting easy either. He'd lie by the window and stare out into the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to him standing stiff by the door, completely still, eyes locked forward. I got up and listened. Nothing, just wind. I opened the door a crack and looked out with a flashlight. The beam caught a trail of fresh tracks in the dirt. They weren't Tank's. They weren't mine. They were human, barefoot, long stride, toes splayed wide like someone who walked without shoes for a long time. They weren't fresh enough to still be wet, but the edges were clear. Whoever left them had walked right up to the door, and then turned around. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, not even the wind now. I locked the door, pulled a chair in front of it, sat with my back to the wall and kept the flashlight and bear spray in my lap. Tank didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. In the morning, I went outside to follow the tracks. They led from the trail to the cabin and then disappeared into the brush to the east, down the slope. No sign of anyone, no broken branches, just those tracks. I couldn't tell how old they were. Maybe a day, maybe less. That afternoon, I tried the satellite phone. Dead, fully dead, not out of signal, no power. I charged it the day I left. It wasn't a cheap one either, it had never failed me. But it was just a brick now. No lights, no response, like something inside had been fried. I wanted to leave right then, but the road out was rough, and I didn't want to risk driving at night through the forest. I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. Tank didn't eat that evening. He sat by the door again, watching. That night, I didn't sleep in the bed. I stayed near the door with my pack, flashlight, and a knife close. At some point, close to midnight, Tank let out a low growl. I sat up. The front porch creaked. Once, twice. I turned off the flashlight. I could hear breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Just on the other side of the door. Not snorting like a bear. Not the chuff of a moose. Just human breathing. Deep and calm, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. I waited, frozen. I gripped the knife so tight my fingers cramped. The breathing stayed for maybe 2 minutes. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. Then the porch creaked again once, as if the weight had lifted. Then nothing. I didn't move until the sun came up. As soon as there was enough light, I packed everything. Tank bolted into the truck the second I opened the door. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I just left. The drive out was tense. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting someone to step into the road. But no one came. It took me 4 hours to reach the first gas station with a signal. I called my friend, told him to never send anyone to that cabin again. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. Back home, I spent the next week jumping at shadows. I slept with a light on. Tank didn't leave my side. I took the satellite phone to a shop. They said the battery had ruptured internally. Not from age, but like it had been exposed to a high voltage surge. I never went back to that cabin. Never even looked up where it was on a map. I didn't report it to anyone. What would I say? That someone walked barefoot in the woods and stood breathing on my porch? I still camp sometimes, still hike, but never that deep, never that remote. Tank's older now, slower, but every once in a while, when the wind hits just right and the trees go still, I see him prick his ears and look toward the shadows. And I remember that breathing, and I remember that we were not alone. I was 39 when I decided to build a small cabin up in the woods near Draycott, a quiet spot in Derbyshire, England. The year was 2016, and I had just left my job in construction management after 2 decades of chasing deadlines and dealing with people who didn't know the first thing about timber or concrete. I'd saved enough and I was tired. Not physically. I could still carry 25 kilograms bags of cement without thinking twice, but mentally, I was worn down to the gristle. I didn't go too far into the woods. About half a mile past the tree line, tucked behind a shallow rise with a gentle stream not far off, there was a flat patch of ground I'd stumbled on years earlier while hiking. I remembered thinking even back then that it'd be perfect for something small and sturdy. The land wasn't mine, but no one cared much about those woods. Most people in the area stayed out, especially after a few odd things had happened years back. Missing hiker, a ranger who never came back, but I chalked those up to nature and bad luck. The truth is, the place had a quiet pull to it. It wasn't menacing, just distant, like it didn't care whether you were there or not. I started building in late October. I wanted something solid enough to last a few winters, but small enough to finish by myself. 4 by 5 meters, single slope roof, timber frame. I hauled the pressure-treated lumber in with a battered trailer hooked up to my old Ford Transit, parking as close to the tree line as I could and carrying everything the rest of the way on foot. Every nail, every board, every length of wire I carried myself. It was hard, but it felt good. No one watching, no emails, just me and the job. The rain started halfway through November. First, just the occasional drizzle, then full-on gray weeks of soaking cold. I had a tarp strung up between trees at first, just enough to keep the worst off me while I worked on the floor joists and frame. I wore gloves under gloves, thermal socks over plastic bags in my boots, and still the wet seeped in. The mud never dried. Every nail I dropped vanished instantly into brown sludge, but I kept going. I didn't plan to stay overnight during the build. I lived 20 minutes away and figured I'd just drive back and forth. But around mid-November, something changed. There was no dramatic moment, no crash or voice in the dark. It just felt like it would be better to stay put. The road back was slippery and narrow. Twice, my van had slid a little on the verge. Once, a fox darted out and I barely missed it. The days were shorter, and by 4:30 p.m., it was nearly pitch black under the trees. I figured if I brought my camping gear, I could work later and get up earlier. So I did. I set up a bivy bag inside the half-frame structure. The walls were just studs at that point, covered with temporary tarps. I laid foam insulation down as a pad and used my winter sleeping bag with a liner. Cold still bit through, but I managed. One night, about a week into sleeping there, the rain came down harder than it had in days. It was a hammering, endless kind of rain that didn't let up for a second. The tarp overhead flapped and bulged with water pooling in spots. I got up twice in the night to poke it with a stick, letting water dump off in heavy sheets. Everything around me dripped, and even inside my shelter, the air was thick with damp. My clothes never dried fully, and my socks smelled like old bread. It was on that same night that I heard the first sound. Not rain, not wind, something else. At first, I thought it was a tree branch cracking in the distance. Then I realized it was footsteps. Not close, but definitely footsteps. Slow ones, one at a time. Not rhythmical like a deer trotting or the scurry of badgers. Just deliberate. I was lying in my bag, eyes wide open, listening with everything I had. The sound came from behind the structure, past where the trees thickened, maybe 20 or 30 meters out. I couldn't see that far in the dark. Even with a headlamp, the beam would just bounce off raindrops. I stayed still, heart thudding, breathing shallow. Then, nothing. No follow-up sound. Just the rain. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a branch. Trees creak when soaked and battered. I went back to sleep. The next morning, the ground was torn up more than I remembered. That patch behind the cabin, where I thought I heard the noise, was disturbed. Not massively, but enough that it looked like someone had walked a short distance and turned around. I hadn't gone back there recently. I always worked from the front or the sides, but I told myself I was imagining it. Rain does strange things to soft ground. Over the next few days, I kept building. Finished the wall panels, sheathed them with OSB, cut the roof rafters. Every night I heard nothing. No more footsteps, no movement, just rain and wind. But I started to feel watched. Not always, but during certain tasks, when I bent down to pick something up or when I had my back turned to the woods, I'd get that crawling sensation at the base of my neck. I'd snap up, look around. Nothing. Just trees. Just wet brown leaves and moss and mud. I finally put up the roof the day before my birthday. I remember because I planned to go into town to get dinner that night. I secured the ridge beam, screwed in the rafters, nailed the purlins. The metal sheets went on clean, and I used my last bit of sealant at the edges. It looked good. Dry inside, finally. I decided to stay one more night and pack up the next morning. That night was the worst. Rain again, of course. Strong wind too. The tarp I'd moved to the door flapped like crazy. I'd stacked lumber inside to dry and wrapped it in plastic. I lay there in the dark, tucked deep in my sleeping bag, headlamp beside me, knife near my hand. Not because I expected anything, just force of habit. It started with tapping. Not inside, not even right outside. Just far enough that I wasn't sure if it was real. Like something hitting wood. Once, twice, pause. Again. Then nothing. Then a scuffle. Not an animal scramble. Not claws. Not hooves. Just like a shoe sliding slightly on wet ground. I froze. Minutes passed. Then the sound came again, but closer. That was enough. I sat up, grabbed my headlamp, and flicked it on. The white circle of light shot through the open slats between studs. Rain poured outside, making vision difficult. I scanned the front, the sides. Nothing. Then I turned slowly toward the back wall, the one closest to the woods. For just a second, in the gap where the wall hadn't been fully sealed, I saw movement. A figure, not clear, not close, but upright, human height, standing still, facing the cabin. I didn't move. Light stayed steady on the gap, but the figure was gone. I thought of yelling, but what was the point? No one was around. I wasn't about to go out and confront someone in the rain at night in the woods. But I knew what I saw. That was no deer or fox. That was a person. I stayed up the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. Just sat against the back wall, knife on my knee, light off to save the battery. I listened. Nothing came back. Morning broke slow and gray. When the light was good enough, I stepped outside, walking carefully around the perimeter. I saw the footprints clearly in the soft mud. One set.
Bootprints.
Tread pattern I didn't recognize. They came in from the west, stopped just behind the cabin, and turned around again. Whoever it was had stood there in the dark, in the rain, watching, then left. I packed up everything I could carry and made 2 trips to the van. I didn't go back for 5 days. When I returned, it was midday, dry for once. Sun peeking through. The cabin looked fine. Nothing broken. But I saw something near the rear corner, half buried in mud. A torn bit of cloth, maybe from a jacket. Blue with a stripe. Looked old, weathered. I bagged it in case I needed to show it to someone. I finished the build over the next 3 weeks, always leaving before dusk. I never stayed another night. I filed a report with the local police just in case. They didn't care much. No crime, no injury. They said it was probably a hiker or some weirdo. Nothing to pursue. But I knew. Someone had watched me in that cabin, in the dark, in the rain. Just stood there, not moving, waiting. For what, I still don't know. I kept the cabin. Still have it, in fact. I go there during the day now and then. The solid, dry, quiet. I installed trail cams too, 4 of them. Never caught anything unusual, but I still check the footage every time, just in case. There's a lock on the door now and a thick bar across the inside. I still build things. It's what I do, but I never build alone anymore. Not in the woods, not at night, not in the rain. It was late September 2023 when I got the job to transport some old logging equipment from a storage yard in northern Vermont to a repair site in upstate New York. The job wasn't anything fancy, just a borrowed flatbed, a few ratchet straps, a long playlist of songs I barely listen to anymore, and a 3-day window to get the work done. I just turned 47 that summer, and I felt all of it in my knees. The cold mornings didn't help either. But the quiet of the open road gave me something I hadn't had in a while. Time away from people, from reminders, from everything I didn't want to think about. It was sometime in the early afternoon when I realized the GPS route would take me through a patch of state road I hadn't driven in almost 9 years, Old Pine Road. A narrow, bumpy stretch of cracked pavement wrapped in thick woods, a place where snow clings long into spring, and where the trees almost lean into the road like they're trying to whisper something to you. But I knew it for one reason only. That was the road her cabin sat on. My ex-wife, June, and I had bought that place when we were still in our 30s. We didn't have much, no kids, just two stubborn people clinging to the idea that isolation might fix a marriage better than therapy could. Didn't. We lasted about another year after that purchase. I moved out and she stayed. I heard secondhand from someone at the feed store that she sold it 3 years ago, maybe 4. But I'd never gone back, never even passed it, until that afternoon. I slowed down as I came off the main highway and started along Old Pine. The leaves had just started to turn. Early bursts of orange and red punched through the still heavy greens. I was surprised the road hadn't been repaved. The truck jolted with every pothole, and I had to hold the wheel tighter to keep the load stable. I told myself I wasn't going to look for the cabin. I wasn't even sure I remembered which mile marker it was near, but you can lie to yourself all you want. The truth is, I scanned both sides of the road the entire time, and then I saw it. The turnoff was still unmarked, just a break in the trees with a narrow gravel path. That gravel used to crunch different under the tires. I remembered the sound. The mailbox was gone. So was the rusted gate we never used. But the cabin was still there, half hidden in the trees like a scar that never healed right. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down much. But I stared. The roof looked the same, though more moss-covered now. One of the porch rails was gone. The windows were dark. It looked empty, but I couldn't be sure. 5 minutes later, I was back to watching the road ahead, feeling like I'd escaped something. That night, I pulled into a rundown motel near Ticonderoga. I showered in silence and ate vending machine chips while watching static flicker across a busted TV. I didn't sleep much. Something about seeing that cabin again, it stirred up things I thought were buried. Not regrets exactly, more like unsettled dust. I figured it would pass. I just needed to finish the job and get back to my place in Brattleboro. The next morning, I loaded up the gear and started heading back the same way. That was the route. No getting around it. I told myself I wouldn't look again. But the second I hit the bend in the road, I knew I would. The cabin was different that time. Or maybe it was just the light. The early morning sun cut sideways through the trees, and it made everything look harsher. I caught something strange out of the corner of my eye as I passed. Something small near the front steps. I thought it might have been an animal or maybe trash someone dumped. I pulled over about a quarter mile past the turnoff. My heart was beating faster than I liked. I told myself it was just curiosity, but I left the truck idling and started walking back. Each footstep on that broken road felt heavier than the last. When I reached the gravel path again, I stood there, just out of view of the cabin. Everything was still. No wind, no birdsong, not even the rustle of squirrels. Just silence. I took 5 slow steps down the path and stopped. What I saw on the porch wasn't an animal or trash. It was a boot, just one, mud-caked and upright, like someone had left it mid-step. It looked newer than anything that should have been there. It wasn't mine. It wasn't hers. It didn't belong. I turned around and walked back to the truck. For the next 2 days, I couldn't shake it. The boot, the silence, the way the air felt heavier near the cabin, like it didn't want me there, or maybe like it did. I called in to say I was taking a few more days before the next job. No one cared. I drove back out there the next evening, just before sunset. This time, I parked right at the start of the gravel path. There were no tire marks, no signs of anyone staying, but the boot was still there. It hadn't moved. I walked slowly toward it, keeping my ears open for any sound at all. Still nothing. That silence, it felt more like pressure now, like something was holding its breath. I stood at the base of the porch and looked around. The windows were still dark, but one was cracked open about an inch. That hadn't been the case before. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I climbed the steps, each board creaking loud enough to make me wince. When I reached the door, I saw that it wasn't fully shut, not locked, not even latched, just resting there like someone forgot to close it or didn't care enough to. Pushed it open. Inside, the place was stripped bare. No furniture, no curtains, just dust, wood, and the smell of old pine. But there were signs someone had been there recently. New scuff marks on the floor, a broken beer bottle in the corner, ashes in the old fireplace. I walked slowly through each room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the tiny loft. Nothing, just echoes of the past and some recent disturbance. But no people, no animals, just that same choking silence. I left. Back at the truck, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting it. The sky had gone orange behind the trees. I kept watching the path like something might follow me out. Nothing did. I told myself I was done with it, that I wouldn't come back again, that some local drifter must have holed up there for a night or two, or maybe the new owners just never cared to maintain it. But even as I drove away, I knew that wasn't it. That night at home, I barely slept. I kept waking up from dreams I couldn't remember. Cold sweat, tense shoulders. I started hearing sounds that weren't there. A scrape, a creak, a knock, always faint, always right at the edge of waking. I went back one last time. It was early morning again, frost still on the ground. I brought a flashlight, a crowbar, and an old revolver I hadn't touched in years. Not because I expected trouble, but because I was tired of feeling like I was being watched. When I reached the cabin, the boot was gone. The door was wide open, and there were footprints in the frost. Bare footprints, human, leading from the porch to the woods behind the cabin. I followed them. I didn't want to, but I did. The woods were thick, too thick. Trees leaned close together, and the light got swallowed quickly. The prints got harder to follow the deeper I went, but they were still there. Not fresh, not old, just there. About half a mile in, I found something I still can't explain. A small clearing, dead center like the trees had bent back out of the way. In the middle of it, a shallow pit maybe 3 feet wide. Inside it, bones. Animal, maybe. I'm not sure, but cleaned, arranged, not buried. Nearby, hanging from a branch, was a bundle of twine and cloth. Old, moldy, but tied deliberately, like a warning or a message. I turned around and walked away, fast. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Every step back to the cabin felt longer than the way in. When I reached the cabin, the door was closed again. No footprints. No boot, just the same choking silence. I drove straight home. I didn't call the cops. What would I tell them? I found some footprints and an old boot, some bones I couldn't identify in a hole that could have been there for a decade. I didn't even take a photo. I didn't want proof. I wanted distance. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The dreams stopped. The noises stopped. I started sleeping again. I told myself it was over. Just my mind playing tricks. Too many memories. Too much time alone. And then one morning, I walked out to my truck and found it. The boot. Same one. Same mud. Sitting upright on my porch like someone had placed it there with care. That was 3 months ago. I moved, changed my number, burned the boot. I never drove that road again. And the cabin? As far as I know, it's still there. But it's not mine. It's not hers either. Not anymore. Whatever's out there, whatever's in there, it's better left alone. All I know is this: if you ever find yourself on Old Pine Road, keep driving. Don't look. Don't stop. Some doors don't need to be opened again. Not twice. I was 37 when I took the job. It was late autumn 2012. I was living in a small rental in Pueblo, Colorado, working construction. Nothing serious, mostly commercial drywall and a few side jobs for kitchen remodels. I'd gotten divorced the year before, had no kids, and spent more nights drinking alone than I should admit. When the call came from a guy I used to work with, Derek, saying there was a gig that paid well, I jumped on it. It wasn't really construction, not in the usual sense. Derek's uncle owned some old land up north, near the Wyoming border, about 30 miles outside a nothing town called Dixon. He had this old trapper's cabin deep in the hills, and he wanted someone to go up there and tear out the rotted foundation and lay in some treated beams. Not a full rebuild, just enough to keep it from collapsing over the winter. The whole place was set back 4 miles from the last road, and there was no cell service. I'd be up there alone, just me, the truck, and the woods. The pay was too good to say no. 10 grand, 5 days of work. Bring my own tools, my own food, my own gas. They even offered an old generator and a tank of diesel for lights and power. I left Pueblo at 5 in the morning on a Thursday. I remember the weather that day: gray skies, some spitting rain by Fort Collins, and a long, quiet drive across the state line. By the time I made it to Dixon, I was low on fuel and had to fill up at one of those old pumps with a cranky card reader and a busted nozzle. I topped off the tank, got some canned stew and a few bottles of water, then took a dirt road Derek had texted me about earlier in the week. After about 10 miles, the gravel road narrowed into a single lane trail, the kind that barely fits one truck. The trees got thicker, mostly lodgepole pines and dry brush. At some point, I passed an old cattle fence and a burned-out barn. There were no houses, no people, just land, quiet, heavy, empty land. I followed the GPS coordinates they gave me, which took me to a clearing with an old rusted gate and a metal post. There wasn't much to it, just a small wooden sign nailed crooked to a tree that read Walker Parcel Private. From there, it was 4 miles in. No road, just a faint track through the forest that barely counted as a trail. I had to put the truck into 4-wheel drive. The trail was slick with wet leaves and ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. By the time I made it to the cabin, the sun had dropped behind the hills, and the air smelled like cold dirt and pine sap. The cabin was worse than I expected. Small, maybe 20 feet by 30. Old log walls, sagging roof, and a busted chimney on the east side. The front door had no lock, just a rusty latch, and the windows were cracked but covered with plywood. It looked abandoned, forgotten. A man could disappear out here and never be found. I killed the engine and just sat there a minute. No sound, not even birds. The stillness was so total it felt unnatural. But I'd been in places like that before. Remote hunting leases, old ranger stations. Sometimes the silence just feels heavier when you're far from anyone. I unpacked my gear, rolled out my sleeping bag inside, set up the portable propane heater, and got the generator going. The whole place shook when I walked on the floorboards. The wood was soft in the center. One section had already collapsed, exposing a crawl space that stank like wet animals and rot. I was too tired to start work, so I heated a can of stew and sat outside on a folding chair. Darkness fell fast. By 6, it was pitch black. The only light came from my headlamp and the dim glow from the cabin window. I didn't stay out long. There was no moon, no stars, just this heavy dark pressing in around the tree line like it wanted to swallow the place. That first night, I barely slept. Something kept scratching under the cabin. I figured raccoons or maybe a porcupine, but it didn't sound like claws. More like something dragging, bumping along the floor joists. I banged on the wall, even kicked the floor, but the noise would stop and then come back 10 minutes later. The next morning, I started tearing out the rotten beams. I wore gloves, a respirator, and took my time. By noon, I had the entire back section cleared out and a new support frame cut. The ground under the cabin was damp, but not flooded. It had that sour animal musk smell, like old fur and dried piss. I didn't see any critters, but I found what looked like chewed bones under one corner. Mostly deer, I think. One looked too clean though, like it had been stripped with a knife. That night I heard it again, but this time it wasn't under the floor. It was outside. It started with a snapping branch, then another, something heavy, slow, circling the cabin in the dark. I turned off the generator and killed the light. Just sat there, crouched with a pry bar in my hand. The footsteps were spaced out, 2, maybe 3 at a time, then nothing, then again on the other side, always just out of sight. I didn't sleep. The third day, I found tracks behind the cabin. Not boots, not paws, bare feet, but not normal. The toes were too long, splayed wide like they didn't fit in shoes. The heel was narrow, and the stride was wrong. Too long for a man my size, and I'm 6'2". They weren't deep enough to be made by someone heavy, but the ground was wet, and the prints looked fresh. They circled the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. I worked fast that day, hammered the new beams in place, bolted supports. My hands shook so bad I bent 3 nails in a row and had to redo half of them. I kept checking the trees, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the wind through the branches and now and then what sounded like breathing. Not close, not loud, just faint, like something just watching, waiting. That night, I locked the door with a chain from my truck and moved the heater next to my cot. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. I sat there with a hatchet in my lap and the lights off. Around midnight, something scraped the back wall. Not a branch, not an animal. It dragged up and down, slow, deliberate. I stayed frozen. Every breath felt like it echoed off the walls. The noise moved to the front, then stopped. I waited, maybe an hour. Then I heard the latch on the front door rattle. Not once, repeated, like fingers testing it. I don't remember passing out, but at some point, I must have. When I opened my eyes, it was morning, and the door was still closed. I stepped outside and checked the clearing. Footprints again, circling, closer this time. One set came within 5 feet of the wall, just beneath the window. The 4th day, I didn't do much work. I was too strung out. Every time a branch cracked, I jumped. Every shadow made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just someone messing with me. Maybe Derek playing a joke. Maybe someone squatting in the woods who didn't like me out here. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt older than that. Hungrier. I went out to the truck to leave around 3. I'd had enough. But the battery was dead. Dead. Not low. Not sluggish. Dead. The cables to the terminals were cut. Clean. With a knife. I stayed in the truck for maybe an hour. Just sat there trying to stay calm. My chest hurt from the tension. My brain kept flashing through scenarios. If I walked out, I'd have to go 4 miles through dense woods. No signal.
No backup.
If someone was watching me, they'd know the route. They'd see me coming. So I waited. That night was the worst. Just after sundown, I saw something move at the edge of the tree-line. Tall, thin, upright. It didn't step out. It just stood there. I watched it for what felt like an hour. Every time I blinked, it looked closer. I finally turned on the floodlight mounted to the truck roof. The thing was gone. At 2 a.m, I heard something on the roof. Not animals. I know what a raccoon sounds like. This was heavier. 2 steps, then 3, then silence. I thought maybe a branch fell. Then came the thud on the porch, and another rattle of the latch. I didn't open the door. I stayed crouched in the back corner of the cabin until dawn. When light came, I stepped outside with the hatchet.
No footprints.
But something left claw marks on the front door. 5 of them, wide, deep. That was the last night. I left everything behind. My tools, my gear. I packed water and a protein bar, grabbed the emergency flare and started walking. I followed the trail back the way I came. I didn't run. I didn't look behind me, but I felt it. Something in the woods, just out of sight, keeping pace. No sound, no steps, just that presence. Like I was being shadowed. When I made it to the gate, I almost cried. I sprinted the last half-mile to the highway, flagged down a truck driver hauling lumber, and rode with him back to Dixon. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't call Derek. I didn't call anyone. I took a bus back to Pueblo that night and never looked back. 2 months later, I got a letter. No return address. Inside was a photo of the cabin, taken at night, from inside the tree-line. And in the photo, the window was lit, and I was standing inside, but I hadn't turned the lights on that night. I burned the letter and photo and never told anyone until now. It was 2013 when I took a break from everything. I was 37 back then, working as a welder in Sheffield. The work was all right, steady, demanding, but it paid the bills. What got to me wasn't the work, though. It was everything else. My marriage had ended the previous winter after nearly a decade, and the house felt like a shell when I came home. I had no kids, just a quiet flat, and the dull hum of a fridge at night. It started getting to me more than I realized. So when an old mate of mine, Gary, told me about his uncle's cabin up near the Scottish border, a bit past Dumfries, I said yes without thinking. He owed the old man a favor and had been checking in on the place during summer months. But this time he couldn't make it. Said if I wanted peace and quiet and some time alone, it was perfect. I left in early September. The roads were already turning orange and gold with the first fall leaves, and the further I got from the cities, the better I felt. I drove past Lockerbie, then followed a dirt track through patchy woods and up a winding hill. The cabin wasn't big, just a 1-floor square with a tin roof and a front porch. But it was far enough from town that you couldn't hear a single car, and the trees were so thick around it that you felt miles from everything. I parked beside a pile of cut logs and unlocked the front door with the rusted key Gary had given me. Inside, it smelled of old pine and damp air. The place had clearly been empty for a while. Dust lay thick on the windowsills, and cobwebs hung between the wooden beams overhead. Still, it was dry, and the firewood beside the stove was stacked high. There was no power, just a gas stove, a lantern, and an old hand-pumped water tap in the kitchen that groaned when you used it. I didn't mind. That was what I came for, just time alone. I unpacked some tins, set my sleeping bag on the creaky bed in the back room, and lit the lantern. The first few days were quiet. I walked in the woods behind the cabin, sometimes sitting for hours near a stream that ran through a shallow ravine behind the hill. I cooked simple meals and read old magazines I'd brought in a duffel. No phone signal.
No clacks.
Nothing but the rustle of wind and the sound of birds. The only odd thing in those first few days was a dull smell that came and went. Not inside the cabin, but out back, near the edge of the woods where the slope dropped off. It reminded me of meat left out too long in summer, but faint, like it was being carried in on the breeze. I figured maybe something had died nearby, a fox or a deer, nothing I wanted to go poking around for. Then one night, must have been my 4th or 5th day, something changed. I had just finished eating and was cleaning out the pot with hot water on the stove. It was pitch dark outside, and I hadn't bothered lighting the lantern yet. Just the glow of the stove lit the room. That was when I heard something on the porch. It wasn't heavy, just a creak of wood, like a boot shifting weight slowly. I froze, listened hard. Then it stopped. I didn't move for a long time, just stood with my hands still in the pot. Eventually I walked to the front door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing, total silence. I opened it slow, the hinges groaning, and stepped outside. The porch was empty. The trees swayed gently in the dark. I shone my torch across the yard, but saw nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, just the same quiet wind. Still, it unsettled me. That night, I kept the lantern burning low, just enough light to see by. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or badger nosing around. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was louder. Not just one creak, but several, like someone walking back and forth slowly on the planks outside. I sat up on the bed and held my breath. The stove was off. No light in the room. I heard the steps move from one end of the porch to the other, and then stop right outside the door. I stayed still for over an hour. I didn't even reach for the torch. Just waited in the dark, heart beating like a drum in my chest. Eventually the creak stopped. No retreating steps, no noise in the woods, just gone. In the morning, I went outside and checked the porch. Again, nothing.
No scuffs.
No footprints in the loose dirt, but that smell was stronger now, much stronger. It clung to the back end of the yard, near the tree line. That smell of old blood and rot. I tried to ignore it, chop some wood, read a few pages of a book. But by evening, I couldn't relax. I ate quickly and checked the locks on the door twice. There were thick wooden shutters for the windows, and I pulled them closed tight. Then I sat in the middle of the cabin, lantern low, knife close at hand. That night was the worst so far. I heard the steps again, just past midnight. They moved back and forth for a while, slow and steady. Then there was a pause, and I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin. Not the door, the wall, like a fingernail or stick being dragged across the wood. Then I heard it move around the side. Not fast, slow, deliberate. I stood there, staring at the door, as I listened to whoever or whatever circle the cabin, scraping at the wood. Then I heard something knock, not loud, just a dull thump, like someone knocking once with their knuckles, and then silence. The rest of the night passed with no more noise, but I didn't sleep. I just sat there until the sky turned gray and the birds started singing. That morning I thought about leaving. I really did, but part of me couldn't make sense of it. If someone wanted to break in, why not just do it? Why this slow circling, this quiet game? By now, I was beginning to feel watched. I walked a few miles that afternoon, hoping maybe to find a farm or a hiker or someone to talk to, but I saw no one. The tracks around the cabin were overgrown. I realized then how truly alone I was out there. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The log pile beside the porch, one of the smaller logs, had been moved. Not rolled, moved. It had been laid upright like a small stool. I hadn't done that. I was sure of it. That night, I made a fire in the stove and left it burning. I didn't bother trying to sleep. I just waited, Sure enough, just past midnight, the steps came again. Slow, measured. This time they circled the cabin 3 times. I counted. I heard a faint knock on each side, almost like a signal, like they were testing something. Then, for the first time, I heard breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. Heavy breathing just outside the back wall, close to where I slept. I stepped back into the hallway, stood in total silence, and listened. It went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. That was the breaking point for me. At first light, I packed my things, locked the door behind me, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached Carlisle. Spent the night in a cheap motel and told myself I'd imagined it all. Stress, isolation, my mind playing tricks. But 2 days later, when I returned to Sheffield, Gary rang me. Said he'd gone up to the cabin with his cousin that morning to grab a few tools his uncle had left. I didn't tell him anything yet, just let him talk. He said the door was unlocked when they arrived. The shutters open, nothing stolen, but there were deep scratches all around the outer walls. Long, wide scrapes about shoulder height, like someone had taken a rough stone or metal and dragged it across the wood. Then he said something that made my blood go cold. He said the log pile had been pulled apart, not scattered, pulled apart and stacked in a square, like someone had made a seat or a small shelter out of it, just a few feet from the back wall of the cabin. I didn't go back. Not then. Not ever. Gary didn't stay long either. Said it gave him the creeps. His uncle passed away the following year, and the land went into probate. The cabin's probably still there, falling apart under the trees. Every now and then I think about it, and when I do, I always remember the breathing. I know it wasn't an animal. I know what I heard. I've gone back and forth in my mind 100 times, trying to think if maybe it was a hunter or a hiker who lost their way. But that place is too remote, too quiet. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to get in. It was watching me, studying me, waiting, and I still don't know for what.